Farm Basics is brought to you by the Liberty Link trait and Liberty herbicide from Bayer. The most reliable weed management solution, Liberty Link and Liberty herbicide are the link to efficient row crop production and sustainable weed management.
During our Farm Basics time today, we'll discuss emptying and filling grain bins. You probably have to fill it before you can empty it, Darren.
Well, that would be an important thing to do. You know, the other thing is grain bins have really changed over the last few years, as when farmers are building new ones, they don't build small ones anymore. They build great big ones in almost every case. And you may be wondering, well, why is that size changing so much too?
Yeah, so first of all, just for example, when we were growing up, a lot of grain bins that got built were around 3,000 bushels. 3,000 bushels today just is not very much. I mean, if a farmer is getting 200 bushel corn, that's only 15 acres worth of grain that he can put in that bin. Whereas when we were growing up and yield was, let's say, 100, then you could store 30 acres in there. So not only was the farm size smaller then, but the yields were a lot less. There just wasn't as much need to have great big grain bins.
Well, that's kind of changed how farmers are filling the grain bins as well. When we talk about getting that grain into the bin, it's one thing when you've got a bin that's 1,000 bushels or 3,000 bushels. They're pretty small. And many farmers have an auger that can push that grain up and drop it in the top, or they may even have a belt conveyor that they would run the grain up and into the bin. Now, as the bins are getting much taller and much larger, some farmers are putting in grain legs. Now, these legs have a belt that goes around, and there are cups that are attached to the belt that lift little scoops of grain up and dump it in the top of the bin. So that's one way of doing it. The other way you could do it is with the vacuum system, where you could actually just suck it right through a tube and drop it up into the bin. So there's a couple different ways you can do things.
Well, quite a few different ways to get the grain into the bin. But as far as getting grain in and getting grain out of bins, it's gotten a lot easier nowadays, because back with the 3,000 bushel bins, a lot of farmers, and like Darren and myself, we've scooped in plenty of those bins. So it's shoveling to get the grain out, or at least part of the way out. So what happens is when these
You're
grain
still bitter
bins,
about that shoveling you did, aren't you, Brad?
No, it just made me a little stronger. Anyway, the point is, what they do with these grain bins is they'll actually have a little floor in them, and below that floor there's an auger. The auger will go to the center of the bin, and so in the old days you had to scoop everything to the center. Well, now you can either use a vacuum system, or they have what's called a sweep auger in there. So a lot of the bigger bins that are designed now, there's a sweep auger that just sits in the bottom of the grain bin, and it's in that bin. You fill the grain bin up, it's still sitting in the bottom of the bin, and that will actually sweep all the way around the bin to bring the grain to the center. So there's almost no scooping anymore.
Well, the good part about that is if we can keep people outside the bin, it's a lot safer for all of us. Where we run into issues, you may hear of farmers from time to time who have an accident in the bin and get hurt or even killed. It almost always happens when they're unloading grain, and many times there may be some moisture that gets in a bin, and they may have a crust over the top, and all of a sudden there's a hollow pocket underneath in some cases, where a farmer may fall through and get sucked in the grain, or as that grain is unloading, he just gets pulled down into the grain. So we want to try and do all the things we can to keep farmers outside the bin and keep them safe.
And the other thing that we always encourage farmers to do is use the buddy system. Never, ever, ever enter a bin unless someone is right outside the bin and ready to help you in case of an emergency.
Well, grain bins are getting bigger on the farm, and we're seeing many more new bins built as both farm size increases and the yield per acre increases. But grain bins can be a very safe way to handle that grain as long as farmers follow the rules and use a buddy system whenever they have to enter the bin, or just buy the new equipment so they can stay out of the grain bin as they're unloading and loading that bin.
Well, grain bins are very important on the modern day farm, but weed control is maybe even more important than that. We're going to discuss how to control this week's weed coming up later in the show.